Has Billy Eppler done a much better job as the Mets GM than we're giving him credit? I'm going to explain why that might be the case on today's edition of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. You also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Now, when a season goes as poorly as this one has for the New York Mets, a lot of times management is blamed. You look at the manager of the ball club, in this case, Buck Showalter, in the dugout every day and how the team has failed to perform for him. And you look at the general manager, the guy that built the team and gave him that roster that has failed to perform. And those are typically your scapegoats. The funny thing is, if we really look at what Billy Eppler did this past offseason, it's actually shocking how many of his moves have worked. And it really what made me, want to look at Epler's tenure as the GM to understand why he might stick around moving forward and why that could be the right decision, or if he should be scapegoated and be blamed and be fired as part of this disaster of a season. So I want to just remind everyone how it all started for Billy Eppler. And it was a long, arduous, agonizing interview process where the Mets could not find an executive. They just couldn't find one. Whether it was anyone just qualified to take the position, anyone who was of the standard of Steve Cohen's desire to be a president of baseball operations, they tried to find somebody to lead that department, a huge hole in the organization since not only Cohen took over, but prior to that with the Bertie Van Wagenen tenure previously. They needed someone to lead baseball ops. And when you look at the backdrop of that with the disaster that was the revolving door of GMs in 2021, Bertie Van Wagenen, Billy Eppler is a far superior executive to what came before him, but that's not a very high bar to climb. But you remember, he gets hired at the 11th hour before a lockout. He doesn't have an office or an apartment. He is basically just spending Steve Cohen's money in hotel rooms over Zoom conferences. And right before the lockout happens, the Mets signed Max Scherzer, Starling Marte, Eduardo Escobar, and Mark Hanna. And that became a big part of the core of a team that won 101 games. And they also added Adam Ottavino, and they traded for Chris Bassett. All of those moves worked out to a certain degree. And we're talking about in the context of 2022, because this year, some of those moves did not work out, particularly Starling Marte. But last year, Marte was an all-star, and Escobar and Cannon were solid, and Ottavino really good out of the bullpen, and Bassett was a stabilizing force in that rotation, and Max Scherzer was awesome that season. Now, the deadline was a disaster in itself for Billy Eppler. A lot of those trades look really bad in retrospect. The Darren Ruff trade's awful. Michael Givens, Tyler Naquin, just terrible trade. Daniel Vogelback. Last year it worked. We just watched Colin Holderman pitching against the Mets tonight. In retrospect, it didn't work. Not a good trade. But the overall result of 2022 was a 101 win ball club. Okay. 2023, we have to look at what he did this past offseason. This is where the conversation gets complicated to me because almost all of these moves were low-key good. And the ones that weren't, you can't really blame Billy Eppler. It's not a lot of poor performance from this free agent class. Edwin Diaz is its own circumstance. I spent an entire show on it yesterday. Not Epler's fault that he got hurt in the World Baseball Classic. There was the decision on Jacob deGrom, a massive one. Do you keep a guy that was potentially on a Hall of Fame trajectory in your uniform for his entire career? Do you keep him or do you move on? The Mets decided to move on. Well, deGrom ended up getting Tommy John this year. Not to say that you could have absolutely foreseen that, but all the injury history, led the Mets to decide to not give him that 5-year deal that Texas was willing to. And ultimately, it worked out for the Mets. They could have gone for Carlos Rodon. The Yankees did. They got him. That has not worked across town. The Mets signed Justin Verlander. And while overall, you could say didn't work because he's not on the team anymore, they got two really good prospects out of him, and he pitched well overall with the Mets. There was an injury at the beginning of the year. Again, couldn't have foreseen that. Then there's the Kodai Senga signing, which is looking great. 3.30 ERA over 22 starts, 149 strikeouts, 122 and 2/3 innings pitched, was an all-star. Compare him to Chris Bassett, because that was the decision that the Mets front office made. It was, are you going to re-sign Chris Bassett or sign someone else? They identified Senga. Bassett this year has a 3.95 ERA over 25 starts, 145 and 2/3 innings pitched. So he's given more innings and more starts to the Blue Jays than Senga has, but he has less strikeouts and more innings, 137. And you look at wins above replacement, according to Fangraphs, they have Bassett at 1.4. They have Senga at 2.5, a full win better. You look at Baseball Reference, they have Senga at 2.8, Bassett at 1 win above replacement. So in that regard, almost 2 wins better. Senga has been the far better pitcher this year. And you look at the contracts, 3 years, $63 million for Chris Bassett. Senga, 5 years, $75 million, opt out after year 3. So if you just look at the 3-year window, assuming that Senga continues to pitch well and eventually opts out, it was basically 3 years, $45 million compared to 3 years, $63 million. And now you still have age 31 and age 32 of Senga guaranteed at $15 million per, compared to age 35 and age 36 on Chris Bassett at $21 million per. Definitely the right decision. Jose Quintana, weird injury. And we've seen when he's pitched this year, he's actually looked pretty good. Resigns Brandon Nimmo. I think Nimmo's, up and down year, the fact that he hasn't always been consistent, has led in part to some of the Mets struggles, but you can't blame him at all for where the Mets are. He's basically been the guy he was last year, maybe a tad worse defensively if you look at the metrics, but last year, 800 OPS, this year, 802 OPS, last year, 16 home runs, and he just hit his 17th home run tonight. He's been really solid. And I think at this moment, you like that contract. They extend Jeff McNeil 4 years, $50 million. He was going to be on your team no matter what. So we'll learn in the next 3 years of this contract if that was a bad decision or not. Jeff McNeil has been better as of late, something that we'll talk about on a future podcast. But again, while we will spend more time with McNeil in the next segment for why things haven't worked out, that contract is sort of something you have to set off to the side. Then you look at the signings of Omar Narvaez and Tommy Pham. Narvaez hasn't performed this year, but at 68 at-bats, he was brought in to mentor Alvarez and to play good defense behind the plate. Because of the injury, wasn't able to. But again, that's not a big line of demarcation on how we evaluate Billy Eppler's offseason. Tommy Pham was a good signing, okay? I wouldn't say my dismay, but I was certainly wrong there. And I actually believe there might be something coming in the mail for me soon on that note. But Tommy Pham, 820 OPS as a Met. Solid. Adam Ottavino bringing him back. Brooks Raley. While I feel like Ottavino's been a little bit disappointing this year, you still look at the overall numbers and they're solid. And Brooks Raley looks like a great trade. He's going to be part of your bullpen again next year. Good moves. Okay, where he messed up, you can argue, is the depth pieces on the 40. Having, not the best options to round out that bullpen. He hasn't shown an ability to build a bullpen really effectively unless you have an Edwin Diaz in it. But then again, if Edwin Diaz was in it this year, everything could have looked different. So it's not to give him a full pass because he really did a bad job in that one regard. But if you were to just rewind to the end of the offseason and not put any of the returning Mets into the forefront, you're just looking at the stats of the additions that were made, the statistics of Justin Verlander up until the deadline, of Kodai Senga, of Ottavino and Raley, of Brandon Nimmo being re-signed. Obviously, the Quintana injury is something else, but the moves that were made this offseason were not the problem. That's what I'm trying to get at here. The problem was the returning players, and that's what we're going to talk about next. And then we'll also look ahead to next year and if Epler's the guy to make these decisions or if he's someone that should still get scapegoated. So we'll get to all of that. Before we do, today's episode is brought to you by Bunches. Bunches is a new app built just for sports fans where you can chat sports in real time. Click the link in the show description to join the app or go to the Apple App Store and download Bunches now, where you can start to have incredible conversations with other Locked On sports fans. Bunches is a place where sports fans can connect. Locked On MLB group chat is available right now in Bunches. Go there now, connect with other baseball fans, chat about your favorite team, and keep up with the latest MLB news. Download the Bunches app today, and when you do, our friends at Bunches have featured the Locked On MLB Bunch in the Discover tab. You can also click the link in the description of the show to join the Locked On MLB Bunch community today. The New York Mets cap off their series against the Pittsburgh Pirates today at 1:10 Eastern Time. Catch every pitch in the Mets hometown broadcast with Sirius XM on the SXM app. Just search Mets. Now, why have the Mets been terrible this year? It's largely because of the guys that were key contributors last year who have just fallen off a cliff. And the first two guys that come to mind, more than anyone else, is Starling Marte and Jeff McNeil. Marte last year had an 814 OPS. This year, 625. Now, he had the double groin surgery. It's clear that he was affected by injuries potentially all season. And if that's the case, why was he playing baseball games? And maybe that's a problem where you can actually pin it on Billy Eppler. That could be the case. But he was cleared enough to play, and he just had an awful season. It's that simple. Last year, he was a 3-win player. This year, he was a negative F-WAR player. It was minus 0.3 on the season. Another guy, that was Jeff McNeil. 836 OPS last year. This year, 677 OPS. His average dropped over 60 points up to this point. On base percentage, over 50 points. Slug, over 100 points. He had 39 doubles last year. This year, only 17. Last year, he was nearly a 6-win player, 5.8 F-WAR. This year, 1.5. Jeff McNeil has been a huge reason for the Mets' struggles this season. Can't get away from that one. And then Daniel Vogelback is another guy. Massive disappointment. Mark Canha and Tommy Pham started the season slow. They eventually turned it on, but that didn't help as the Mets got out of the gate pretty bad. And then the third base position was just a disaster all year long. First was Eduardo Escobar. Then Beatty came up, was hot very early and very briefly, cooled down and was run out there every day, which I can't blame the Mets. Long term, that's what you had to do. But man, did it look awful. And for the season, that position for the Mets, which is now mostly Danny Mendick, I guess, they're hitting 219, 278 on base, 340 slug. And there's only 3 teams in Major League Baseball that have a negative F-WAR at third base. Again, F-WAR is wins above replacement according to Fangraphs. You have the Oakland Athletics, the Detroit Tigers, and the Mets. The Athletics, it's negative 0.1. The Tigers, negative 0.5. The Mets, negative 1.3. The third base position has cost the Mets over a win this year when it comes to F-WAR. That is brutal. Then you look at the pitching side of things. Obviously, the injuries to Quintana for most of the first half, or I guess all of the first half. Verlander to start. Scherzer here and there being nicked up. All of those were bad. But, really what it comes down to was the up and down performance from Scherzer and Verlander. More Scherzer than Verlander, but still. And then honestly, it's more even Carlos Carrasco, David Peterson, and Tyler McGill just being awful across the board. Awful. Well, Carrasco was good last year. Peterson, good. McGill was hurt, but you had at least some thoughts that, hey, if he's your 8th starter, that's pretty solid. And all of a sudden, McGill's in your rotation. Come opening day. And, pitched good the first month, I guess. But overall, the numbers have been bad. David Peterson has just been, I know I've already said train wreck a couple times, but it just has to be the description I go to when you look at some of these guys. And Carrasco has not been much better than Peterson at this point. Maybe it's even worse. I don't know. He has basically gotten to the point where I'm wondering, is this the last year of Carlos Carrasco's career? Because it certainly might be. Now, all of that bad pitching led to an overused and taxed bullpen. And when you remove Diaz from the equation, too, everything has just crumbled for this team throughout the year. But when you look forward and you think about the decisions that have been made overall by this organization and how the plans have been executed, the farm system, because of this deadline, is in a good place. They did well on all the trades. So you give Eppler credit there. The guys they've decided to commit to long term. Lindor was not Epler's decision, but I think it was a good one by the franchise. Nimmo looks like a good contract right now. Senga looks like a good contract right now. Everything else was short term. The only bad one at this point, the one contract on the books without looking at the dead money, but that's going to be on your books playing for you moving forward that I look at and go, is Marte. And you hope that this is just a horrible year because of health, and next year you get a revitalized player. That's what you have to hope for. But I don't think that the overall decision making has been that awful outside of the deadline last year. And if you go into a deadline and the directive is we're not going to trade our top prospects, we are trying to continue to win, but we're not looking to gut the farm, you get the type of lackluster deadline that they had. And in retrospect, I don't know. Maybe they should have traded Brett Beatty or Mark Vientos last year for that team. And maybe that team goes on a run to win the World Series, or maybe that team still ends up out in the wild card and you lose those guys who still have a chance to be part of your future. We will never know. But you look at the offseason signings that the Mets have made over the last couple of years, those have been pretty solid. And I think if you get a better executive in above Billy Eppler, and that's what everyone hopes is going to happen with David Stearns, I think Billy Eppler, as your GM, being the number 2 in your organization, I actually think he's going to be a really good asset to the Mets moving forward, especially when you think about the work he has done getting players from the NPB with Kodai Senga being the GM that signed Shohei Ohtani, with Ohtani now being a free agent this offseason, with Yamamoto coming over as a starting pitcher the Mets really like. I think Billy Eppler is not going anywhere, and I think that's the right decision for this franchise. And I don't believe that what's happened this year can be blamed on him. I think if you want to blame Buck Showalter, there's certainly an argument to be made there. But primarily, it is just the players, and particularly those guys that I highlighted this segment that came back this year and off of great seasons last year, completely failed to meet expectations. And that's why we're at this point in the season where the Mets playing a game in the middle of what's supposed to be a playoff push in mid-August has turned into a time where I'm not discussing Mets games until the final segment of the show. But we will do that next because the pitching in this one against the Pirates tonight was so bad it deserves to be discussed. So we'll get to that in a minute. Before we do, today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need to find parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors, because with eBay's guaranteed fit, you can be sure that every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage, look for the green check to know the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. With over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. So get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay's guaranteed fit only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. The New York Mets will look to win their series against the Pittsburgh Pirates today, 1:10 Eastern Time. Catch every pitch of the Mets' hometown broadcast with Sirius XM on the SXM app. Just search Mets. And the Mets lost 7-4 tonight, and it was mostly due to a just brutal 7th inning. Before that, though, David Peterson was the starter, and he couldn't make it out of the 4th inning. It was awful. He needed 91 pitches to record 14 outs, threw 48 strikes to 43 balls, walked 6. A lot of times he just doesn't look like he knows where his stuff is going, and that's not a good place to be in. He struck out 5. There's still some nasty sliders he'll rip off. I'm at the point, David Peterson, where I think his future is going to be coming out of the bullpen. And I hate that I've gotten to that point when I came into this year and believed in David Peterson as much as I did. Because if you want to look at all of my preseason takes, there's probably none worse than the fact that I thought David Peterson could be a good 3 on an MLB team. But last year, you look at the stats, look at the numbers, you look at where his stuff was going, how he was locating, how he was striking out batters. Everything about David Peterson was pointing to a guy that had a long-term future in an MLB rotation. And this year, he just forgot how to pitch. And I feel like he's looked the best when he's been in that bullpen this year. And the stuff will play up there. And when you have a bullpen that still has so much in flux moving forward, and you're not going to be able to go out and rebuild one, that's probably the hope. Maybe. I don't know. I guess the hope is that he's in the rotation. But man, he has not, with this opportunity to come back in this rotation, done anything to solidify a spot next year. And that's why I guess my hope now is maybe they turn a good reliever out of him. Jose Budo, saw him again. It's been a while. Hasn't had a good season at Syracuse, but they were hoping that they could bring him back, get the stuff to play up a little bit out of the bullpen. And it did. He touched 97 tonight. Didn't know Budo had that one in the tank. And he looked really good early, like shockingly good. Came in for Peterson in the fourth, stranded a runner with a strikeout. That was his first of 5 strikeouts. Then pitches a 1-2-3 fifth with 2 strikeouts. Worked around some trouble in the 6th. But then Buck Showalter sent him out for the 7th. And I didn't like that decision. Not that it matters. These games don't. But I felt like Budo, and I guess it doesn't matter, but it just, like, let some guys have good feelings every once in a while. Budo went out. He got you 2 1/3 scoreless with 4 strikeouts. Let him sit on it, man. I get it, though. He's a guy that's supposed to give you length. Maybe you can get length, but it was also a game the Mets could have won. Not that it matters, but Budo comes out. I think he walked the first batter, then he gave up a double, and all of a sudden he's in a hole, got a strikeout, walked another one, loaded the bases up. And now his line looks way worse than it probably should have based on how effectively he was pitching earlier in that game. Grant Hartwig comes on, gives up all of those runners because, how much experience does Grant Hartwig have coming into a bases loaded spot in the big leagues? You don't think he's going to bail you out of the jam? Not going to happen. Then he gives up 3 more runs of his own, and the ball game is effectively over. So, no point in spending time talking about the home runs by DJ Stewart and Jonathan Arauz. The Mets lost. Nimmo homered. I said that earlier. Who cares? Let's take a trip around the affiliates, shall we? Where's the Binghamton hat? Let's get the Binghamton hat on here. All right. Trip around minor league baseball. We're going to start doing this a little bit where I want to take a trip around the affiliates, particularly Brooklyn, Binghamton, Syracuse, the 3 highest levels, where you're going to see a lot of the Mets' top 10 prospects, top 10 to top 20 if you look at some of the arms that are in Binghamton. And we could just break down what some of these guys are doing. So we'll start in Brooklyn, high A. Mets lost 4-2. Alex Ramirez went 1 for 2 in the game with 3 walks. Ramirez has not had the best season in Brooklyn last year. He held his own at 19 years old in high A. Started this year, 20 years old in high A. The thought probably was, if he does really well in 50 more games there, you send him up to Binghamton and he's well on his way. Well, 100 games in Brooklyn this year, he has a 675 OPS. Hasn't quite worked out for Alex Ramirez just yet, but he's still a very young prospect that has a lot of upside. So we'll see what the rest of this year brings, and of course, what he'll do next season. I wonder if he's going to get a 3rd tour of duty in high A. Ryan Clifford, the second guy the Mets got in the Justin Verlander trade. He went 0 for 5 today, but he does have 2 home runs in his first 10 games with Brooklyn. Moving on to Double-A, the Binghamton Rumble Ponies. They lost 9-6. Blade Tidwell got knocked around real bad. Didn't make it out of the 4th inning. Gave up 6 hits, 4 walks, 6 earned. Did have 5 strikeouts, but a rough night at the office for arguably the Mets' best pitching prospect. You also have, of course, Luis Angel Acuna and Drew Gilbert starring on that team. Acuna went 1 for 4 with a walk and a run scored. Gilbert hit his first home run as part of the Mets organization. So that was nice to see from him. Finally, Triple-A Syracuse. We know the guys that you're watching there. Brett Beatty, Ronnie Mauricios, and Beatty had a massive game. He went 2 for 4. He had a grand slam off of Jared Eichhoff, 2021 Mets legend, of course, which if we watched him pitch that year, maybe not the most impressive thing in the world that Brett Beatty took him deep for a granny, but hey, he'll take those RBIs and those juiced up stats any day if you're Beatty. He also drove in Ronnie Mauricio later in the game with an RBI double. So 5 RBI night for Beatty. I think he has 25 RBIs on the year now in AAA, which is pretty ridiculous. And Ronnie Mauricio, speaking of him, he scored that run. It was actually one of 2 runs he scored in the game. Also drew a walk, went 1 for 3. So that's your trip around the affiliates. Not a great night for the Mets overall, top to bottom in the organization, but there's always tomorrow, especially for all of you everydayers. Make sure you tune into tomorrow's show where I'll recap the end of Mets Pirates. Look ahead to the next series that the Mets are playing against the Cardinals. And maybe we're going to do a little bit of a dive into Jeff McNeil's season. That's a tentative plan, but you can tune in tomorrow to find out if that's what we go with on Locked On Mets. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show, Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. If you want to catch every pitch in the Mets hometown broadcast, you can do so with SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just search Mets.